My husband threw me the most beautiful surprise birthday party I had ever seen. 40 candles on a custom cake, fairy lights strung across our entire backyard. My closest friends, my neighbors, my coworkers, all there, laughing, holding glasses of champagne, shouting "Surprise!" When I walked through the back door, I cried. I actually cried. I held Miles's face in my hands and told him he was the most thoughtful man I had ever known. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "You deserve every good thing in this world, Dana." Everyone heard him say it. Everyone smiled, and I believed him. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly imagined, was that exactly 72 hours before that party, my husband had sat inside a lawyer's office and signed a document declaring me mentally incompetent. He had been building the case for 5 years, and I had smiled through every single day of it. Let me tell you who I was before all of this. My name is Dana Calloway. Well, Dana Mercer after I married Miles. I was a high school English teacher for 11 years. I loved my job. I loved my students. I had this tradition where I'd read the last page of a great novel aloud on the first day of school instead of the first page, just to show my students that endings could be beautiful too. I'm telling you that detail because it matters later. I believed in beautiful endings. I believed in them with my whole heart. I met Miles at a charity fundraiser when I was 28. He was tall, confident, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately seemed like he belonged there. He was a financial consultant, successful, well-dressed, articulate. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when he talked to you. On our third date, he told me I was unlike anyone he'd ever met. He said it quietly, almost like he was confessing something, like it surprised him. I fell in love fast. Too fast, maybe. But I didn't know that yet. We married 14 months after we met. Small ceremony, 60 people, a venue outside of the city surrounded by oak trees. My mother walked me down the aisle because my father had passed 5 years earlier, and she squeezed my hand at the altar and whispered, "He's a good one, sweetheart." We bought a house in a quiet suburb. Miles kept growing his consulting business. I kept teaching. We had routines: Sunday morning pancakes, Friday night movies, summer road trips with no real destination. We didn't have children, not for lack of wanting, but we had a life that felt full. Warm. Safe. I want you to hold on to that word. Safe. Because for 12 of the 14 years I was married to Miles Mercer, I genuinely believed I was safe. The small things, the first tiny cracks, they appeared so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. Almost. The first thing I noticed was so small that I actually laughed it off. It was a Tuesday evening, about 2 years before my 40th birthday. I came home from school later than usual because I'd stayed to help a student with an essay. Miles was in his home office, door closed, which wasn't unusual. He often worked late, but when I passed the office door, I heard him say something that stopped me mid-step. He said, "She doesn't know anything about it. She never looks at those accounts." I stood there in the hallway, my school bag still on my shoulder, listening, then silence. A chair rolling back. The sound of him ending a call. I kept walking to the kitchen before he opened the door. When he came down for dinner, I almost asked him about it. The words were right there in my mouth. But then he complimented the pasta I'd made, and we started talking about a funny thing that had happened at school that day. And somehow, the way you do, I just let it go. She doesn't know anything about it. She never looks at those accounts. I should have asked. I should have asked that night, that very night, and maybe everything would have been different. But I didn't. The thing that truly started everything, the thread that unraveled my entire life, was a credit card. Specifically, it was a credit card that didn't work. It was a Saturday in October, about 8 months before my birthday. I was at the grocery store, my cart loaded up with everything I needed for a dinner party we were hosting that weekend. I swiped my card at the register, and the machine made that flat, dead little beep that everyone dreads. Declined. I smiled at the cashier, the embarrassed kind of smile, and tried again. Declined. I switched to a different card. That one worked fine, and I chalked the whole thing up to some kind of bank error. Those happen. I wasn't worried. But when I got home and logged into our joint account just to check, I stopped cold. The balance was $312. We had never in 14 years had a joint account balance under several $1,000s. We were not rich, but we were comfortable. We were responsible. Miles handled most of our finances. Something I'd always been quietly grateful for, because numbers stressed me out, but I knew roughly what we had. $312 was not roughly what we had. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the number on my laptop screen for a long time. Then I told myself, he must have moved money somewhere. A savings account, an investment. He does things like that. Moves money around for tax purposes, for quarterly things I don't fully understand. He always mentions it afterward. He just hadn't mentioned it yet. I closed the laptop, I went upstairs, and I almost let it go again. But something made me go back down and open the laptop one more time. And this time, I clicked on the transaction history. I sat there for 45 minutes reading through withdrawals I didn't recognize. Not small ones. Large, systematic transfers going back nearly 8 months. Thousands of dollars at a time, moving to an account number I didn't recognize, labeled only with a series of numbers. My hands were shaking by the time Miles's car pulled into the driveway. I heard the front door open, his keys on the hook, his footsteps in the hallway. I closed the laptop again. I don't know why I closed it. I think part of me was afraid of what his face would look like when I showed him. I think part of me already knew, somewhere deep in my chest, that his face would look like something I wasn't ready to see. "Hey, you're home early," he said, coming into the kitchen. He kissed my cheek. Oh, completely normal. Completely Miles. "Yeah," I said. "Just got in." I watched him pour himself a glass of water. "Miles," I said. "Did you move money out of the joint account recently?" He turned around and looked at me. And here is the thing. Here is the thing that has stayed with me ever since. His expression didn't flicker. Not even for a millisecond. It was completely, perfectly calm. "Yeah, sorry," he said. "I should have told you. I moved some funds into a new investment vehicle. Quarterly returns are better. It's temporary. I'll explain the whole thing over dinner." He smiled. I nodded. He explained it at dinner. Numbers, percentages, timelines. It sounded real. It sounded logical. He was confident and patient and answered every question I had. I believed him. I believed him completely. But that night, lying in the dark while Marcus slept beside me, I kept thinking about a word he'd used. He'd said the funds were reallocated. Not invested, reallocated. It was a small distinction. It probably meant nothing. But I lay awake until 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something I couldn't name yet, was deeply, deeply wrong. I want to be clear about something. I am not by nature a suspicious person. I am not the kind of woman who goes through her husband's phone, or reads his emails, or checks his location on a map. I had never done any of those things in 14 years. But after that night, after the credit card and the bank account and the word reallocated, something shifted inside me. Some quiet animal part of my brain woke up and said, "Pay attention." So I started paying attention. I started small. The next time Miles was in the shower, I picked up his phone from the nightstand. My heart was hammering. I felt ridiculous, guilty even. I unlocked it. He'd never had a passcode. He always said he had nothing to hide. That should have been comforting. It wasn't, because when I opened his recent calls, there was a number I didn't recognize that he'd called 11 times in the last 2 weeks. No name attached. Just a number. I memorized it. I put the phone down before he came out of the bathroom. Later that day, while Miles was out at a client meeting, I Googled the number. Nothing came up directly. No business listing, no social media profile, just a number. I called it. It rang 4 times and then went to voicemail. A woman's voice said, "You've reached Vivienne. Leave a message." That was all. Just Vivienne. I hung up without leaving a message and sat there in the kitchen for a very long time. Now, I want to be fair to myself here. Vivienne could have been a client, a colleague, a real estate agent, a dozen completely innocent things. Miles worked with a lot of people. He had clients who were women. This was not evidence of anything. I told myself that. I repeated it several times. But here's the thing about paying attention. Once you start, you can't stop. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. 2 weeks later, I noticed something new. We had a dinner with friends, our neighbors, the Harmons, a couple we'd known for years. Jim and Patricia Harmon, good people, the kind of couple you could call at midnight if you needed to. We'd had hundreds of dinners with them. We were sitting at their kitchen table, and Miles was telling a story about a client of his, something funny that had happened in a meeting. Everybody was laughing. Patricia leaned over to refill my wine glass, and as she did, she said something very quietly. So quietly that I almost didn't hear it. She said, "You doing okay, hon?" But the way she said it, it wasn't casual. It wasn't the way you ask someone if they want more wine. She was looking at me with this careful, measured expression, almost like she was watching for something. "Of course," I said. "I'm great. Why?" She glanced at Miles for just a fraction of a second. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, nothing. You just look a little tired." She moved away to refill Jim's glass. I sat there with my wine and turned the exchange over and over in my head. Why had she looked at Miles? Why had she asked me that? After dinner on the walk home, I tried to bring it up casually. "Patricia seemed a little off tonight," I said. "Did you notice?" Miles shrugged. "I didn't notice anything. She's probably just stressed. Jim said they've been having some money trouble." It was a perfectly reasonable answer. I let it go, but I didn't forget it. I filed it away in the growing cabinet of small, strange things I couldn't yet explain. A month before my birthday, Miles went on a 2-day business trip. He did this occasionally, conferences, client meetings in other cities. It was normal. I always used the time alone to grade papers, eat whatever I wanted for dinner, and go to bed at 9 o'clock with a novel and a cup of tea. That's what I planned to do. What actually happened was different. I was looking for the stapler, the good one, the heavy one that actually works. And I knew Miles kept it in his home office. I went in there and started looking through his desk drawers. The stapler was in the second drawer, but under the stapler, tucked beneath a manila folder, was a smaller envelope. Plain white, sealed. My name was written on the front. Not Dana, not Mrs. Mercer, just written in handwriting I didn't recognize. I stood there holding it for a moment, then I opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. It was a letter. Typed, not handwritten. No signature. And it said, "You need to look at the Holbrook estate filing from 2019. Your name is on the original deed. Ask yourself why it isn't anymore." That was the entire letter. I read it a third time. I didn't know what the Holbrook estate was, but I was about to find out. Let me explain something about my family background because it matters enormously here. My father, Walter Calloway, passed away when I was 23. He was a quiet man, hardworking. He'd spent his entire life as an electrician, and he wasn't what anyone would call wealthy. When he died, he left me a small amount of savings and the house I grew up in, which I sold because I couldn't afford the upkeep. What my father never told me, what I genuinely did not know for years, was that he had inherited a commercial property from his own father, my grandfather. The property was a modest commercial building in a part of the city that, when my grandfather first acquired it, was considered undesirable, industrial, forgotten. By the time I married Miles Mercer, that neighborhood had been completely transformed. New restaurants, new developments, new money flooding in from every direction. The building, 3 stories, 8,000 square feet, right on the corner of what had become one of the most coveted streets in the city, was worth somewhere in the range of $4 million. I did not know any of this when I married Miles, but Miles did. He had known from our third date. I found all of this out later. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to that night alone in the house, holding that letter, completely in the dark about everything except for one name. The Holbrook Estate. I sat down at Miles's desk and opened his computer. It wasn't password protected. Again, nothing to hide. I typed Holbrook Estate into the search bar. What came up was a property records database entry. A filing from 2019. A commercial property at an address I vaguely recognized but couldn't immediately place. The current owner was listed as Mercer Capital Holdings LLC. I didn't recognize that name either. But the Mercer made my stomach drop. I scrolled further down the filing. There was a section showing the ownership history, and in 2018, 1 year before the current filing, the property had been owned by a trust. The Walter Calloway Family Trust. My father's name. My blood went cold. I sat in that chair in my husband's office, in the quiet of our empty house, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. This was my father's property. This should have been mine. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Miles's office for 6 hours, going through everything I could find. I was shaking. I was nauseous. But I kept going because stopping felt like something I couldn't afford. Here is what I pieced together over those 6 hours and the days that followed. When my father died, he left behind a small estate that included the family trust holding the Calloway building. The trust was structured so that I was the primary beneficiary, but execution required a co-trustee signature. My father had named his old friend, a man named Gerald Whitfield, as co-trustee. Gerald Whitfield died 2 years after my father. And when Gerald died, the co-trustee role had to be assigned to someone new. According to the documents I found buried deep in Miles's filing cabinet. Documents I had never seen. Documents I had never been asked to sign. My husband had petitioned the probate court to be named successor co-trustee of my father's trust. In 2017, 1 year before the property was transferred. In 2017, we had been married for 3 years. I was 31 years old. I was teaching sophomore English and coaching the school's literary magazine. I had no idea. He had filed the petition without telling me. He had used a lawyer, a woman named Vivian Cole, to handle the paperwork. Vivian, the name on the voicemail. I put my hand over my mouth and just breathed. He had called Vivian Cole 11 times in the last 2 weeks. She wasn't a friend. She wasn't a client. She was the attorney he had used to steal my inheritance. And apparently he was still using her. But for what? I kept digging. The next thing I found was a folder labeled simply DC Medical. DC. Dana Calloway. My initials, my original last name, not my married name. I opened the folder with my hands trembling. Inside were printed emails. Printed, which told me Miles had been careful. Careful enough to want paper copies of something he didn't want tracked digitally. The emails were between Miles and a Dr. Raymond Holt. I didn't know who Dr. Raymond Holt was, but I was about to. The emails spanned 3 years. They discussed, in careful clinical language, a patient profile. The patient was not named, but certain details made it unmistakably clear that the patient was me. Subject demonstrates occasional anxiety and emotional volatility. Subject has expressed confusion regarding financial matters. Subject's social isolation has been gradually increased per our conversation. I read that last line 3 times. Subject's social isolation has been gradually increased. I thought about the last 3 years of my life. I thought about how slowly, almost imperceptibly, my world had gotten smaller. How Miles had started suggesting gently that certain friends of mine were negative influences. How he had encouraged me to cut back on my teaching hours because I seemed stressed. How Sunday dinners at my mother's house had become monthly, and then every few months, and then something that required effort and scheduling, and always seemed to coincide with something Miles needed me for. I had thought it was just life, adulthood, busy schedules. It had been deliberate. Every step of it, he had been shrinking my world on purpose. The last email in the folder was dated 6 weeks before my birthday. Miles had written, "Timeline is on track. I believe we'll be ready to move forward with the petition by the end of Q1. She has no one left who would effectively contest it." Dr. Holt had replied, "Agreed. The documentation we have is more than sufficient. Proceed when you're ready." I sat in that office chair and I understood, fully, completely, finally understood, what my husband had been building. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my mind. Or rather, he was building a story in which my mind had already been stolen, in which I was unstable, confused, isolated, incapable of managing my own affairs. He was building a case to have me declared legally incompetent, which would give him full legal control over every asset connected to my name, including the $4 million building that should have been mine. I want you to understand something about the birthday party. I need you to really sit with this. Miles knew, on the day of that party, while he was hanging those fairy lights and ordering that cake and hugging my friends, he knew exactly what he had been building for 5 years. He knew about the lawyer. He knew about the doctor. He knew about the documents that were already drafted, waiting for a judge's signature. And he hung those lights anyway. He looked me in the eye and said, "You deserve every good thing in this world. There is a kind of evil that doesn't look like evil. It doesn't sneer. It doesn't give itself away in dark rooms with cold eyes. It wears a good watch and makes you breakfast and holds your hand at the movies and waits. That's the kind that breaks you." But I'm getting slightly ahead of myself again, because before the birthday party, there were still things I needed to learn. There were still layers I hadn't reached. After I found the folder, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I memorized the key details. I did not confront Miles when he came home from his trip. This was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Watching him walk through the door with his overnight bag, kissing me hello, asking what I wanted for dinner, and smiling and saying, "I missed you." I smiled back. I said, "I missed you too." And I started making my own plan. The first person I called was my sister. Now, I need to explain about Renata. Renata is 4 years older than me. We were close as children. Inseparable, really. But in the years since I married Miles, we had drifted. I had always attributed this to life, distance, the natural drift of adult siblings who are busy with their own worlds. What I now suspected was that the drift had been engineered. I thought back to specific moments. Miles saying Renata seemed unstable after a family dinner. Miles suggesting, when Renata was going through a difficult divorce, that maybe it's better to give her some space. Miles making small comments over the years, never cruel, never obvious, just consistent, that painted Renata as someone unreliable, someone whose closeness was more trouble than it was worth. I had listened. I had given Renata space. Now, sitting in my car outside a coffee shop 3 miles from my house, because I was no longer comfortable making calls from home, I dialed my sister's number and waited. She answered on the second ring. "Dana?" She sounded surprised. We hadn't spoken in almost 4 months. "Renata," I said. My voice cracked. "I need you." There was a pause. And then my sister said something that told me everything. She said, "I've been waiting for you to call." We met the next day. Renata had her own things to tell me. Things that, on their own, might have seemed like coincidences. But layered on top of everything I already knew, they formed a picture so complete and so damning that I had to press my hands flat on the table just to keep them steady. About 2 years earlier, Renata had run into Miles at a restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon. Miles was with a woman Renata didn't recognize. They were not behaving like business associates. Renata had called me that evening and told me what she'd seen. What I told her, according to Renata, and I have no memory of this conversation, was that I knew about it, that it was a client event, and that she needed to stop interfering in my marriage. I have no memory of saying any of those things. Renata had believed me. She'd backed off. She'd felt guilty for prying. The woman Miles had been with was Vivian Cole. But there was more. Renata had also, about a year ago, received a phone call from a woman she didn't know. The woman had asked whether Renata had noticed any concerning behavior from me recently. Whether I'd seemed confused, forgetful, emotionally erratic. Renata had said no, absolutely not, and had asked who was calling. The woman had said she was a healthcare coordinator and had given a name Renata hadn't written down. Renata had assumed it was some kind of telemarketing call and hadn't thought much of it. Now, we both understood what it really was. Miles had been collecting witness statements. He had been calling the people in my life, my friends, my colleagues, my own sister, and planting seeds, asking leading questions, establishing a narrative about my mental state. And with each person he'd spoken to, he had carefully, deliberately begun to distance them from me, ensuring that if the day came when I tried to raise the alarm, the people around me would remember months or years of carefully constructed doubt. I thought about Patricia Harmon at the dinner table. "You doing okay, hon?" She had looked at Miles before she asked me. He had gotten to Patricia too. I thought about my coworkers at school, who had seemed slightly different with me recently. More careful, more watchful. There had been a moment last spring when the vice principal had asked me very gently if I was managing okay with my workload. I'd been confused and slightly offended. Now I understood. He had been feeding a story to everyone around me, the story of a woman losing her mind. And everyone, one by one, slowly, over years, had started to half believe it. Renata was the one who figured out the full scope of the financial piece. She was an accountant. Numbers were her language in a way they had never been mine, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that. I gave her every document I had photographed on my phone during that night in Miles's office. I gave her the account numbers, the transfer records, everything. And I went back into that office one more time, carefully, methodically, when Miles was away at a Saturday morning client meeting. What Renata found over the next 2 weeks was staggering. Miles had transferred the Callaway building, my grandfather's building, my inheritance, into Mercer Capital Holdings LLC in 2018. He had done this using his co-trustee status on my father's trust. It was legal, technically. Or at least it had been structured to appear legal. But here was the thing Renata found. The transfer had required my signature as the primary beneficiary, a signature that appeared on the documents, a signature that was not mine. My name, my date of birth, even a version of my handwriting, practiced enough to pass a casual inspection, had been placed on legal documents transferring my inheritance out of my name and into a company he controlled. This was not just manipulation. This was forgery. And the building was not the only asset. Through a series of financial maneuvers that made my head spin, as Renata explained them, Miles had also quietly drained a life insurance policy my father had left in my name, redirected the proceeds of a small portfolio my father had built over decades, and funneled everything, all of it, through Mercer Capital Holdings LLC, which had then used the assets to leverage a much larger real estate portfolio. Conservative estimate. Miles had diverted approximately $5.5 million worth of assets from my name to his over a period of 6 years. 6 years. 1 year before we even discussed having the conversation about my father's estate, which meant he had known about my inheritance before he ever took me to dinner for the first time. I sat with that for a long time. He had met me knowing. He had fallen in love with me, or performed love, or done whatever it was he did, knowing exactly what I was worth. Not to him, not as a person, as a transaction. But even that wasn't the bottom of it. Because here is the piece that still makes me catch my breath when I think about it too directly. The petition to have me declared legally incompetent, if it had gone through, would have served 2 purposes. The first was obvious. A guardian controlling my affairs could, in theory, continue to manage those assets indefinitely. With me declared incompetent and Miles positioned as my legal guardian, he would have had permanent, court-sanctioned control over anything still connected to my name. The second purpose was darker. With me declared incompetent, any claims I might make, any legal challenges, any accusations of forgery or fraud would be dismissed. A woman without legal standing cannot file a lawsuit. A woman whose own doctors have testified to her mental instability cannot be believed. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was eliminating me as a witness to my own robbery. He was going to make me disappear, not physically. Something more thorough than that. He was going to make me disappear legally, socially, psychologically, make me into a woman whose word meant nothing. While my body was still walking around in the world, smiling at birthday parties, and teaching sophomore English and holding his hand at the movies. The birthday party was on a Saturday. The following Monday, Miles told me he was working from home. He was on calls all day. I moved around the house quietly, doing ordinary things, watching him from across rooms. He looked relaxed, content. He looked like a man whose plan was working exactly as intended. That evening, he got a phone call and stepped outside onto the back porch to take it. I walked to the kitchen window. Through the glass, I watched him pace the length of the porch. He was talking with his hands, animated, confident. He laughed at something, a real laugh, unguarded. My phone was already recording. I had purchased a small external microphone attachment 3 days earlier. I had tested it quietly in the living room while Miles was upstairs. The sound quality was remarkable. I held my phone against the kitchen window screen. I could hear him. Not perfectly, but enough. All filed. Cole says the judge has the petition, and we're looking at 2 to 3 weeks for the initial hearing. A pause while the other person spoke. No, she has no idea. I'm telling you, she's completely. He laughed again, softer this time. She's not going to be a problem. Another pause. The building alone is worth 4.2, maybe 4.5 now with the market. And then the rest of the portfolio on top of that? We're talking a very good year, my friend. A very good year. He laughed a third time. Then he said something that turned my blood to ice. He said, "She actually cried at the party. Cried, held my face and told me I was thoughtful." A pause. "Yeah, I know. I almost felt bad." Another pause, and then his voice lightened again. "Almost." He went back inside. I stood in the kitchen holding my phone. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel it in my throat. I had it. Not everything. Not on that recording alone. But I had his voice, his words, the names, Cole, the petition, the building, the timeline. More importantly, I finally had something I hadn't had before. I had certainty. In the weeks after the party, Renata and I worked with an attorney. A real one, not Vivian Cole, named Sandra Park. She was a forensic financial attorney who also worked closely with a private investigator named Don Marsh. What Don Marsh uncovered over the following 3 weeks was the complete, unabridged version of my husband's life. And I want to walk you through it, because every single piece of it matters. Miles Mercer had done this before, not on the same scale, not with the same level of sophistication, but the blueprint, the pattern, had been practiced. His first marriage, which he had never mentioned to me, lasted 14 months. It ended with his first wife, a woman named Carla, signing over the rights to a small piece of commercial property she had inherited from her uncle. She had signed the papers, she later told Don Marsh, during what she described as the most confusing and frightening period of her life. A period during which she had been isolated from her family, told by multiple people, including her own doctor, that she was suffering from a stress-related condition, and generally made to feel that she could not trust her own perceptions. She had never used the word gaslighting. This was 15 years ago. The word wasn't part of everyday language yet, but the experience she described was unmistakable. Miles had left that marriage with a modest profit and a clean record. He had then spent 3 years researching his next opportunity. He had found me. Don Marsh traced the specific moment, a charity event, a guest list, a conversation with a mutual acquaintance who had casually mentioned that Dana Calloway, lovely girl, teaches high school, father, recently passed, had inherited a commercial property in an area people were starting to pay attention to. Miles had put me on a list. Then he had attended the same charity event. Then he had walked across the room and introduced himself and told me I was unlike anyone he'd ever met. He had known everything, from the very beginning, the 5 years of the relationship before the manipulation became active, those years of Sunday pancakes and road trips and hand-holding. I don't know entirely what to do with those years. Sandra Park told me not to get lost in trying to understand what was real and what wasn't, that it was irrelevant to the case. Renata told me those years were stolen from me just as surely as the money was. My therapist, who I started seeing in secret using Renata's address because I trusted nothing in my own life at that point, told me that people like Miles aren't incapable of warmth. They use warmth. It's a tool like anything else. I chose to believe the therapist. It helped a little. Vivian Cole, as it turned out, was not just Miles's attorney. She had been his girlfriend for 3 years. They had met through a real estate transaction, one that had used my inheritance without my knowledge, and the relationship had grown from there. She was the one who had structured the forged transfer documents. She was the one who had coached Miles on building a psychological record for the competency petition. She was the one who had made the calls to people in my life, asking about my mental state. She was very good at her job. She was also, as it turned out, not as careful as she thought she was. Dawn Marsh found 3 emails that Vivienne had sent from a personal account, a mistake she had made early in the process, before she switched to encrypted communications, that referenced the forgery in explicit terms, not vague terms, explicit ones. Terms like the signature we prepared, terms like the documentation we created. 3 emails, that was all we needed, Dr. Raymond Holt, the physician whose emails I had found in Miles's filing cabinet, had been providing Miles with a psychological assessment framework, but he had never actually met me, never actually examined me. He had been writing a patient profile based entirely on descriptions that Miles had provided. That, as Sandra Park explained with a controlled fury I found deeply comforting, was not medicine. That was fraud. We moved on a Thursday. Sandra Park had coordinated with a district attorney's office and with the forensic accountants who had been quietly working through Mercer Capital Holdings LLC's records for the previous 2 weeks. I was not present for the arrest. Sandra advised me not to be, and she was right. I was at Renata's house, sitting on my sister's couch with a cup of tea, when my phone buzzed. Sandra, it's done. Miles was arrested at 7:43 in the morning on charges that included forgery, fraud, and financial elder abuse. A charge that applied because some of the assets traced back to my late father's estate. Vivienne Cole was arrested the same morning. Different officers, different location. She had been at her office when they came, Dr. Raymond Holt was not arrested that day, but a medical board complaint was filed. He eventually lost his license. I feel something about that, but I'm not sure yet what it is. The competency petition, of course, was immediately dismissed. The judge, upon being informed of the circumstances, reportedly used the phrase egregious abuse of the legal system, which Sandra Park repeated to me with the kind of satisfaction I imagined she had earned. The transfer of the Callaway building was declared fraudulent. The forged signature was verified by 2 independent forensic document examiners. The property was returned to my name as primary beneficiary of my father's trust. 4 months. $2 million in legal costs from Miles's frozen assets. A full forensic accounting of Mercer Capital Holdings LLC. At the end of it, after everything was tallied and the courts had done their work, I recovered approximately $4.2 million in assets. I cried when Sandra called me with the final number. Not the way I'd cried at the birthday party. Different tears. Heavier and cleaner at the same time. The trial took 8 months. I testified on the 2nd day. I walked into that courtroom and I sat in the witness stand and I described as clearly and as precisely as I could what my life had looked like from the inside for 14 years. What it was like to trust someone completely. What it felt like when that trust was revealed to be a construction. What it meant to realize that the man sleeping beside you had been watching you, studying you, shaping you, for almost the entirety of your adult life. I looked at Miles twice during my testimony. The first time was when I described finding the folder labeled DC Medical. He didn't look away. He held my gaze with the same calm, steady expression I had seen in the kitchen the night I asked about the bank account. The expression that gave nothing away. The second time was right at the end, when I was stepping down from the stand. I don't know why I looked. I don't know what I expected to find. His expression hadn't changed. I think that was the final thing I needed to understand about him. Miles was convicted on 7 counts. Vivienne Cole pleaded guilty and cooperated. She received a reduced sentence. Miles received 12 years. I was in the courthouse when the verdict was read. Renata was sitting beside me, her hand in mine. Sandra Park was at the table in front of us, perfectly still. When the judge read the verdict, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph exactly. I felt something more like the moment at the end of a very long sentence when you finally find the period. Relief. Just relief. It's been almost 2 years since all of this. I still live in the same city, but a different house. Smaller, quieter, mine. I have a garden in the back that I am extremely bad at but deeply committed to. I adopted a dog, a large, ridiculous golden retriever named Walter, after my father. I went back to teaching. I wasn't sure I would. For a long time, the thought of standing in front of a room full of teenagers and being responsible for anything felt impossible. But I went back. 9th grade this year, first time in a while. The first week was hard. The second week was better. By the third week, I remembered why I started. I still do the thing with the last page of the novel. Renata and I talk every few days. We have a standing Sunday morning phone call. Last week, she told me something that made me laugh for the first time in a while. Really laugh, the kind that surprises you. I see my therapist every 2 weeks. My mother, who Miles had gradually convinced I was difficult and too needy, called me the week after the verdict and cried for 20 minutes straight. We see each other for dinner most Sundays now. She makes the pasta I always loved as a kid, and we watch whatever crime documentary is trending, and she shakes her head a lot and says people. Just that. People. Patricia Harmon came to see me about 3 months after the arrest. She stood on the porch of Renata's house. I was still staying there then, and she could barely look at me. She said Miles had approached her over a year ago, told her I had been showing signs of early cognitive decline, and asked her to keep an eye on me. She'd been worried. She'd believed him. She hadn't known what to do. I told her I didn't blame her. I don't, genuinely. He was very good. He had had years of practice by the time he got to the people around me. He had studied how to be believed, Patricia cried. I held her hand on the porch. It was a cold afternoon and neither of us had a coat on and it didn't matter. People ask me, sometimes, what the hardest part is, whether it's the money or the years or the betrayal or the embarrassment. It's none of those things. The hardest part is the memory problem. Not the kind Miles tried to manufacture, the real kind, the honest kind. There are memories of my marriage that feel completely real, warm, genuine good. The road trips, the Sunday pancakes. The way he'd read the book review section of the newspaper out loud at breakfast and do terrible fake voices for different critics. I don't know what to do with those memories now. I don't know if the warmth in them was real and used, or if it was constructed from the beginning. I don't know if I ever actually knew him, or if I knew a character he played for 14 years. My therapist says this uncertainty might never fully resolve, and that learning to sit with it, not to need an answer for it, is part of the work. I'm still learning. Here is what I know with certainty. My father was a quiet, hard-working man who spent his entire life building something for me without telling me about it. He believed in leaving people better than you found them. He believed in doing the right thing even when no one was watching. He named a trust after his family, and a man with a good watch and a calm expression tried to take it, and tried to take me with it. He almost succeeded. He almost made me disappear, not from the earth, but from myself, from my own name, my own history, my own credibility. That, more than anything, is what I think about when I think about what he did. Not the money, the name. He tried to take my name from me while I was standing right there. I kept the building. It's still on that corner, 3 stories of old brick, right where the neighborhood turned into something new. I don't do anything dramatic with it. I have tenants. Small businesses, mostly. A bookshop on the ground floor, which my father would have loved. Sometimes I drive by it when I don't have anywhere particular to go. I don't always stop, but sometimes I do. I sit in my car, and I look at those 3 stories of old brick, and I think about my grandfather, who bought it when the street meant nothing. And I think about my father, who kept it and never sold it and never even told me it existed, maybe because he didn't want me to value it for what it was worth. He wanted me to value it for what it meant. It took me a long time to understand that. It means I was here. It means I stayed. It means that everything he tried to build, across a lifetime of quiet, ordinary, extraordinary work, survived. It survived him, and it survived Miles Mercer, and it survived every forged signature, and every manipulated witness, and every email between a corrupt lawyer and a dishonest doctor. It survived, and so did I. I still do the thing at the beginning of each school year, the last page instead of the first. My new 9th graders looked at me like I'd lost my mind last September when I walked in and said, "We're starting at the end." One girl in the back row, serious, watchful, the kind of student who reminds me of myself, raised her hand and said, "Why?" I told her what I always say. Because endings can be beautiful. Because knowing where a story goes doesn't mean you know what it costs to get there. Because the ending only means something if you understand everything that came before it. She wrote it down. I hope she keeps it. I hope wherever she ends up, she remembers that the story of a life is not just what happens to you. It's what you find out. It's what you do with what you find out. It's whether you keep going after the finding out, when going is the hardest thing in the world. Some people don't leave you. They just spend years trying to make you someone who was never really there. The trick is making sure they don't succeed.